In the middle of a violent storm on a deserted road in Georgia, an elderly black woman spots a stranded car and a desperate man waving for help. Inside, his pregnant wife is in labor, early, terrified, and ignored by every driver who passed them by. Without hesitation, the woman brings them home and steps in to help. What she doesn't know is that the moment she opens her car door, she sets off a chain of events that will change her life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you watching from. We love to hear your thought. The sun was beginning to bleed out behind the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the dirt roads of Sweetwater County, Georgia. It was early October, just before the real chill of fall, and the air hung heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. The breeze had grown restless, curling around fence posts, rustling cornfields now tired and thinning. People were hurrying home, pulling children inside, latching windows. The weatherman had said a storm was coming, a real one. But Ruth Eleanor Carter, age 68, wasn't the kind of woman to flinch at a forecast, not after everything she'd weathered. Her pickup truck, a dented Ford from a year most people forgot, crawled up the gravel road that led back to her family's farmhouse. What was left of it? Windows warped from age, paint peeled like sunburnt skin. But still it stood, like her, weathered, rooted, proud. Inside the truck, Ruth's hands, dark and calloused from years of soil and livestock, gripped the wheel. Her wrists ached, her knees too, but she ignored them, like she always had. A broad straw hat rested in the passenger seat next to a worn canvas tote filled with canned goods and feed. She'd spent the afternoon at Dawson's General, picking up essentials before the storm. The cashier, a boy young enough to be her grandson, barely looked her in the eye. That didn't surprise her anymore. As the road narrowed and the trees pressed in closer, her headlights flickered against the darkening sky. The wind had begun to howl louder now, throwing dust against the windshield. She glanced up at the rearview mirror. Not at the traffic, there was none, but at herself. Her deep brown eyes, ringed by decades of grit and grief, stared back. Not judgmental, just tired. Still, something in her posture remained upright, not rigid, just unwilling to bend. She muttered to herself, low and gravelly, "Ain't no storm gonna scare me off my land." Her voice carried a soft southern drawl, the kind that wrapped around words like a protective arm. There was no audience, yet she spoke with conviction, as if she had to remind herself that holding on to this land, this battered patch of legacy, still mattered. She could have sold it years ago. Developers had come knocking, offering shiny checks and fake smiles, but Ruth always said no. This house was built by hands that had once been denied everything: freedom, dignity, rest. No amount of money could erase that history, or the blood beneath the porch boards. She passed the old Carter barn, leaning now, sagging like an old man but still watching over the fields. Her lips curved into a bitter-sweet smile. That barn had seen births, deaths, family reunions, and heartbreaks. Every timber had a memory, and Ruth remembered them all. Then suddenly a crack of thunder snapped across the sky, the kind that didn't just rumble, it split. Ruth's smile faded. The wind pushed harder. The trees began to dance wildly, and the first drops of rain slapped against the windshield like impatient fingers. She leaned forward. "Let's get home, girl," she whispered to the truck, patting the dashboard with the kind of affection some reserved for pets. Her voice, despite the storm, remained calm, low, grounded. But even as she turned onto the final mile toward the farmhouse, something in her gut stirred. A flicker. That old intuition, what her mama used to call the whisper God gives women when trouble's nearby. Ruth narrowed her eyes at the road ahead, now shiny with rain and shadow. She didn't know it yet, but this storm, this very night, would test not just the strength of her home, but the vastness of her heart. And just as Ruth rounded the final bend toward the gate of her land, the heavens split open. The rain came down in sheets, thick, punishing fast, drumming the hood of her truck with a violence that turned everything outside into streaks and smears. Her wipers beat back and forth with desperation, but the world had already blurred into water and wind. Trees bent sideways like they were bowing to something angry. Leaves spiraled through the air like startled birds. The red clay beneath the tires grew slick, trying to pull the truck sideways, but Ruth kept steady, jaw tight, eyes narrowed with that quiet determination only a woman who'd lived through 6 decades of storms could carry. She was maybe half a mile from home when she saw it. A shadow on the right, then movement. A hand. It was barely visible through the deluge, but unmistakable. A figure. No, 2. One standing outside the vehicle, drenched, arms flailing. Another slumped inside, obscured by fogged-up windows. The car, a white SUV, was tilted at an odd angle, one tire deep in the mud, hazard lights blinking weakly, like the heartbeat of a dying animal. Ruth instinctively hit the brakes. The truck slid a bit before stopping. She took a second, looked hard, her heart thudded. Not out of fear, but instinct. Something wasn't right. And she had that feeling again. The whisper. She rolled down her window slightly, letting in the slicing wind and rain. The man was shouting something, waving his arms wildly. "Please, help us! Please! My wife's in labor!" His voice cracked from panic, desperation, and a storm. Ruth didn't wait another second. She shoved the gear into reverse, maneuvered her truck closer to their vehicle, and turned on her high beams. Rain pounded her shoulders the moment she stepped out, her coat soaked instantly, hat nearly torn from her head. But she kept moving. She'd seen storms like this take roofs, barns, and even lives. If that woman was in labor, she didn't have time to think twice. "What happened?" Ruth called out, her voice sharp, slicing through the wind. The man, white, mid-30s, trembling, was holding onto the door of the SUV, eyes wide with a kind of fear that was more than just weather. "We were on our way to the hospital. My wife, she's early. She started having contractions. And then the car just died. I tried flagging people down, but no one stopped. No one." His voice broke, cracking in the middle like glass under strain. Ruth's eyes flashed with something between disbelief and contempt. Nobody stopped for a pregnant woman? Her tone was tight, furious beneath its calm. She didn't wait for his answer. She yanked open the passenger door and was met with the sight of a young woman curled up, groaning through clenched teeth, her face pale and soaked with sweat, one hand gripping the seatbelt like it was a lifeline. "How far apart?" Ruth asked firmly. The man blinked. "What?" Her contractions. "How far apart?" she snapped, already pulling the passenger door wide and motioning for him to help. 4 minutes, maybe 3 now." "That ain't good. We need to move now." With a strength that belied her age, Ruth helped the young woman shift into the back seat of her truck, laying a blanket down beneath her. The man followed behind, fumbling, apologizing, thanking her, shaking from adrenaline and cold. Ruth slammed the door shut just as thunder cracked directly overhead, rattling every bone in her body. As she climbed back into the driver's seat, soaked to the bone, she muttered under her breath, "Not to God, not to the storm, but maybe to her mama, long gone but never far. I guess this old house of ours is going to see one more life tonight." And with that, she slammed her foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward into the chaos, back toward the farmhouse, unaware that within minutes she'd be delivering a child into this world with nothing but her hands, her heart, and the strength passed down through generations. The tires groaned against the slick mud as Ruth's truck thundered down the last half-mile stretch toward her farmhouse. The rain had turned cruel now, sideways, stinging like needles. Branches littered the road, and the wind screamed through the pine trees like it had a warning no one could hear in time. But Ruth kept her grip tight on the wheel, jaw clenched, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds where the young woman writhed in pain across the back seat. The girl's breathing was fast, too fast, and her hands kept reaching for something, anything to hold on to. Ruth shouted over the noise, not taking her eyes off the road. "You hang in there, baby girl, we're almost there. I got you, just hold on." Her voice was low, solid, the kind of voice that could still a frightened horse or hush a room full of arguing men. The woman, no older than 25, clutched her belly with both hands, her face glistening with rain and sweat. It hurts so bad, she gasped, eyes wide, her voice high and trembling like a violin string pulled too tight. Ruth nodded once, sharply. That means he's coming. You just breathe. Don't fight it, you breathe. The truck skidded slightly as they turned into the gravel drive. The farmhouse loomed ahead, dark except for the warm amber glow leaking out through the kitchen window. It wasn't much, but tonight it would have to become a sanctuary. Ruth didn't park so much as stop the truck in motion, throwing open the door before it had even fully settled. She moved fast, not like a woman her age should, but like someone who had no time to waste. Get her out. We'll use the kitchen. It's warm, close to water. The man, shivering, soaked, looked frozen with fear. What do you need me to? What should I? Move, she snapped, not unkindly, but sharply enough to jolt him into motion. Inside the house, the lights flickered as the storm screamed outside, but the kitchen held steady. The wooden table, worn smooth by decades of family dinners, now became an operating table. Ruth had already cleared it, laid down clean towels, boiled water, lit the gas stove to keep the room hot. She moved with an eerie calm like she'd done this a dozen times. And she had. She didn't speak much, not unless she needed to. Her eyes did the talking now, sharp, clear, commanding. The young woman, her name now known to Ruth as Claire, was on the edge of panic. It's too soon. It's too early. He's not supposed to come yet, she cried, her voice breaking into sobs. Ruth was beside her in a heartbeat, kneeling by the table, gripping her hand. Listen to me, sugar. You hear that storm outside? Claire nodded, tears pouring down. Storm don't scare me. You know why? Because I've survived worse. And you? You're stronger than you think. That baby's coming and we're gonna help him, you and me, right now. Her tone wasn't a suggestion, it was a vow. The man, Claire had called him, stood in the corner, helpless, until Ruth barked, "You love her!" "Yes, of course!" more than anything. "Then get over here, hold her other hand and breathe with her." His face crumpled into something raw, and he obeyed. From that moment on, the house became something sacred, a battlefield, a womb, a prayer. Minutes stretched like hours. Claire screamed, sobbed, bit her lip, begged. Evan whispered to her, kissed her forehead, wept. And Ruth, she was the anchor, telling her when to push, when to breathe, when to hold. Lightning lit the room, thunder roared, but inside those four walls time stood still. Then, suddenly, a final push, a cry, a breath held. And then it came, a baby's first cry, high, clear, alive. Ruth held him up, cord still attached, slick and wriggling like something caught between heaven and earth. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from something else, a release, a memory. She wrapped the child quickly, placing him in Claire's arms. "He's here. He's okay. You both are." Claire sobbed into the blanket, kissing her son's wet forehead, whispering, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over again like it was the only word left in the English language. Ruth stood back, finally exhaling, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. Her shirt clung to her frame, soaked not just from the storm, but from the intensity of a moment no one in that room would ever forget. She looked at them, this couple so far from home who'd nearly lost everything, and then she looked at the child. A new life, in her home, on her table, delivered by her hands. She didn't smile. Not yet, but her eyes shone. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. The storm had softened to a steady rhythm now, like a lullaby after a scream. Rain tapped gently against the old glass panes, as if to apologize for its earlier fury. Inside the warm kitchen, the baby slept on Claire's chest. Faded, full of stories, Evan sat close, full of stories. 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 Evan sat close, full of... He hadn't spoken much since the birth. He watched Ruth carefully as she moved around the kitchen, cleaning up without a word, placing towels in a tin pail, wiping down the table like this was just another Thursday. But there was something heavy behind his eyes, something unfinished. Ruth noticed. She always noticed. She glanced at him once, then back at the kettle hissing on the stove. "Storm's letting up," she murmured, her voice low and calm, but edged with something deeper, something waiting. Evan looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I need to tell you something," he said suddenly, quietly. Ruth didn't answer. She simply placed a mug of warm tea in front of him and sat down across the table. Her silence said, "Go on." He took a deep breath. His jaw clenched. "I tried to get help. I swear I did. When the car broke down, we were about 10 minutes out from the highway. She was already screaming in pain. I panicked." His voice cracked as he looked over at Claire, now resting with the baby still asleep against her. "I waved my arms. I stepped out into the road. I stood in front of cars, dozens, maybe more." Ruth's face didn't move. Not a twitch. Evan's eyes filled. "They looked at me. Some of them slowed down, but no one stopped. One guy, he actually rolled down his window, asked what was wrong. When I told him my wife was in labor, he shook his head and said, 'Sorry, not tonight, man,' and drove off. He laughed, bitterly, choked on it. Another couple said they'd call someone and just left, but no one ever came, no one." The words hung in the room like smoke. Ruth took a slow sip of her tea. Her hands didn't shake, but her voice had a new weight when she finally spoke. "You think they didn't stop because she's white?" Evan looked confused. "What? No, why would that—" "I've lived a long time," Ruth interrupted, her tone not accusatory but factual, long enough to know that fear doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it shows up in nice cars, clean clothes, and folks with empty hearts. You didn't ask for much, just help, and they kept driving." Evan's eyes dropped again, ashamed, but Ruth didn't let him sink too far. "What matters is, you did stop, you waved, you begged, you fought. That's love. That's worth something." Then, softer, with a trace of steel. "But the rest of them? I hope they remember that night for the rest of their lives. I hope the guilt crawls up their spine every time they pass a car on the side of the road." The wind outside moaned through the trees, like it too was listening. Claire stirred slightly, half awake, her voice a whisper. "They looked at me like I was trouble." Ruth walked over, checked her pulse gently, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "That's because they've forgotten what it means to be human," she said softly. Ven looked up, his voice cracking with something beyond exhaustion, something raw, visceral. "You saved us. I don't even know your name, but you saved us. Why? Why would you do all this for strangers?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She glanced out the window toward the dark field beyond, the barn barely visible in the distance. Her voice came after a long pause, low and quiet. "Because someone once saved me, and I never got to say thank you." She turned away then, her silhouette framed by the soft kitchen light, still, strong, enduring. Ruth didn't expect to see them again. By morning the storm had passed. The sun had returned with an almost guilty brightness, like it hoped to erase what the night had done. Dew glistened on the tall grass outside, and the field steamed gently in the early light. Ruth stood on the front porch, arms folded, a mug of coffee warming her palms, her eyes on the gravel path leading out. The white SUV was gone. Evan had thanked her more times than she could count, and Claire had hugged her with tears still drying on her cheek. The baby, tiny and wrapped in one of Ruth's oldest quilts, had left sleeping. They were just three strangers caught in a storm. Ruth hadn't asked for money or names. That wasn't why she stopped. But as the days passed, a quiet returned to the farmhouse. The kind of quiet that sometimes felt like peace and sometimes like absence. She tended her chickens, checked the roof, patched the barn door flung loose during the storm. The land was still hers, still old and tired, but still standing. That was enough. Or at least it had always been. Until the black car came. It was 5 days later. Late afternoon, the kind of time where shadows start to stretch and light turns gold. Ruth had just come back from the garden, dirt under her fingernails, sweat on her brow, when she saw it. Sleek, polished, out of place. A black Lincoln, spotless even on the gravel drive, with chrome that caught the sun like a blade. The driver, a tall man in a sharp gray suit, stepped out and opened the back door. And that's when he emerged. Evan, but not the Evan she remembered. He was wearing a navy blazer, crisp white shirt, leather shoes so clean they looked afraid of dust. His hair was styled, his face freshly shaved, but what stood out most wasn't his clothes. It was the presence. He wasn't just a man now. He was somebody. Ruth narrowed her eyes, standing firm on the porch, arms still crossed. Evan walked up slowly, his voice steady but softer than before. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," he said, "but I couldn't leave things the way they were." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Didn't seem broken to me." Her voice was neutral, but her eyes searched him. Evan smiled faintly, glanced around the porch, the rocking chair, the worn wooden floorboards. "I didn't tell you who I was that night," he said. "I wasn't trying to hide it. It didn't feel right." Ruth didn't respond, only tilted her head slightly. "I'm Evan Wallace," he said finally, "founder and CEO of Wallace Tech." There it was, the name, the one on every billboard between Atlanta and Raleigh, the name that came with money, power, headlines. Ruth didn't blink. "So," that one word landed like a stone. Evan's smile faltered. "Most people react differently," he admitted. "They start treating me like I'm worth something just because I made a few billion." Ruth's voice was even, slow, deliberate. "I treated you like you were worth something before I knew your name. That's the difference between me and them." Evan's shoulders dropped, just slightly. He nodded. "That's exactly why I came back." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, extending it toward her. "This is just a start. A thank you. For saving Claire. For delivering my son. For saving me, if I'm being honest." Ruth didn't take the envelope. She didn't even look at it. Her voice cooled. "If you think I stopped that night for a reward, you don't know me at all." Evan drew his hand back slowly, ashamed, the envelope trembling slightly. "I don't," he said quietly. "But I'd like to." Ruth studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, not out of anger, but discernment. There was something different in him now, something stripped away, humbled, honest, maybe even useful. She stepped aside just enough to open the door behind her. "You come all this way, you might as well have some coffee." Evan exhaled in quiet relief, stepped forward. As he crossed the threshold, he glanced down at the floor. The same place his son had been born just nights earlier. His eyes softened. He didn't know it yet, but this visit would change more than just him. The coffee steamed gently between them, two mismatched mugs on the old pine table that had seen more life than most kitchens ever would. The silence between sips was not awkward. It was deliberate, grounded. Outside, the cicadas had begun their evening chorus, and golden light pooled through the lace-curtained window. Evan sat straighter than most visitors, legs crossed, fingers laced, eyes scanning the room as if trying to memorize it. Ruth, across from him, remained still. She had changed into a clean flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her face calm but unreadable. He took a breath. "I've thought about that night every day since. About you. What you did. What it meant." Ruth raised one brow. "I didn't do it for meaning. I did it 'cause no one else would." He smiled faintly, then grew serious again. "That's the point. You did something that people with power, with money, with everything, didn't. You acted. You cared." His hand went to the envelope again, still resting on the table where she'd left it untouched. "So I want to help." Ruth didn't look down. She didn't have to. Evan leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, sincere. "Let me pay off your land, renovate the house, put in plumbing, new roofing, whatever you want. I can bring contractors here by next week. I'll set up a trust, too, so it stays in your name, passed down to whomever you choose. This place? It shouldn't fall apart when you're the one holding it together." Ruth watched him, long and quiet. He continued, his tone almost pleading. "I can do more. For the community, a clinic, a food co-op, internet access for the schools around here. Just tell me where to start. You've given me something I can never repay. At least let me try." Ruth finally spoke, slow and level, her voice carrying that same quiet gravity that had steadied Claire through contractions. "You want to give out of guilt or out of purpose, Evan Wallace?" He flinched slightly. "I want to give because it's right." She leaned back in her chair, hands folded. "Then don't start by throwing money at the woman who didn't ask for it." Her eyes narrowed, but not cruelly. "Start by fixing what's broken where it counts. Not here," she tapped the envelope. "Here." And she tapped her chest. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment he just nodded. "I didn't mean to insult you." "You didn't," she replied, then softened. "Just barely. But don't assume folks like me are waiting for a handout. This land, it's not failing. It's just tired. And I'm still here. That means something." He looked down, the weight of her words sinking into him. Then slowly, he reached for the envelope and slipped it back into his coat. "Okay," he said quietly. "No renovations, no blank checks." Ruth tilted her head. "So why are you really here, Evan Wallace?" He took a long breath. "To listen," he answered. And for the first time that evening, Ruth gave him a nod that almost passed for approval. She stood, picked up the mugs, and moved to the sink. Over her shoulder she said, "Good. Then you might want to stick around tomorrow. The county holds its food drive in town, and the folks there could use someone with a big car and a pair of working hands." Ben smiled at that. "You think they'll want help from someone like me?" Ruth turned, drying her hands with a towel, her face expressionless except for a flicker in her eyes. "Depends on whether you show up as Evan Wallace or just Evan." He didn't answer. But something shifted in him then, something real. And as he walked back to the black car parked under the dying light, he didn't look quite so polished anymore. He looked like a man unlearning who he thought he was. It started quietly. A week after Evan Wallace left Ruth's porch, a box truck rolled into Sweetwater's Old Town Square, flanked by two smaller vans. No press, no logos. Just a few men in jeans and utility vests unloading crates of fresh produce, sealed medical kits, laptops, and solar chargers. At first, people watched with suspicion. This wasn't the kind of town where miracles showed up on wheels. But then Evan himself appeared. No blazer, no entourage, wearing work gloves, unloading boxes, sweat darkening his collar. He didn't speak much, just lifted, hauled, unpacked. By mid-morning, he was sorting canned goods beside a retired nurse named Linda, who once said she didn't trust city men with shiny teeth. By noon, she was telling him stories about her late husband while he loaded her car with groceries. Word spread fast. He came back the next week with contractors not to fix Ruth's house, as she'd warned him not to, but to rebuild the abandoned post office into a multi-purpose center, clinic, food pantry, free Wi-Fi hub. And he didn't do it from behind a desk. He was there when the roof beams went up. He hammered nails. He painted walls. When someone asked him why a billionaire was hauling drywall, he just said, "Because someone stopped for me when no one else would." Meanwhile, Ruth kept her distance, watching from the edges of the market. From her truck, arms folded, eyes narrowed. She didn't trust fast change. Fast change didn't last. But what Evan was planting didn't grow fast, it rooted. One Sunday, she found a small envelope tucked into her mailbox. Not cash this time, but a letter in careful handwriting. We named her Eleanor, middle name Ruth. She's strong, like you. Claire says she has your eyes when she's angry. We're bringing her to meet you this weekend, if you'll have us. Ruth held the paper in her calloused hands for a long time, not smiling, not crying, just breathing, steady. Then she folded the note and placed it beside a photograph on her mantel. Her parents, standing in front of that very porch 70 years ago, proud, upright, black and bold, their dignity shining brighter than the sun that day. Saturday came. A red SUV turned down her drive, stirring dust and memories. Claire stepped out first, radiant, holding a baby girl in soft pink. Evan followed, carrying a picnic basket, eyes nervous but warm. Ruth opened the door before they could knock. The baby was nearly walking now, soft curls, wide, curious eyes, and a laugh like springtime. Ruth didn't say much as Claire gently offered the child into her arms. She just held her, steady, strong, and whispered, "You came into this world screaming, didn't you?" The baby babbled in response, grabbing at the collar of Ruth's shirt with tiny, determined fingers. They sat on the porch that day, sharing cornbread, lemonade, and silence that said everything words couldn't. Evan eventually stood and pulled something from the basket, a small wooden sign, hand-carved, smooth. He handed it to Ruth with both hands, his voice almost breaking. "The town center's almost finished. We want to name it after someone who actually saved lives." Ruth read the engraving slowly. "To the newly opened Eleanor Carter Center, where kindness begins." For a long time she said nothing. Then she stood, holding Eleanor in one arm, the sign in the other, and looked out across the field. Her voice was soft but carried like thunder. "Names are just words, but what you build, that's what they'll remember." Evan nodded. Claire reached for his hand. The baby, nestled against Ruth's chest, had already fallen asleep. As the sun dipped low, casting honey-colored light over the land, Ruth leaned back in her rocking chair, her body still, but her spirit wide open. In that moment, she wasn't alone. She wasn't forgotten. And the house, that old, tired house, had never felt more alive. Sometimes, storms don't come to destroy. Sometimes they bring the people you never knew you needed. Sometimes the smallest acts, stopping on a rain-slick road, opening your door to strangers, plant seeds that grow into legacies. And in the heart of Sweetwater, under the name of a woman who once delivered life in a kitchen lit by lightning, a new kind of future was beginning to bloom. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.